Associate of Paul Manafort's pleading guilty today to a federal crime and admitting to arranging an illegal foreign donation to Trump's inauguration. Samuel Patten pleading guilty to charges of failing to register in the U.S. as a lobbyist for a foreign agent. He agreed to cooperate with Bob Mueller's team. Mueller referred the case to the D.C. prosecutor, but perhaps the most striking part of the case is this. Patten admits illegally helping a Russian and a Ukrainian, making a $50,000 donation to the Trump Inauguration Committee. Now, of course, foreigners aren't allowed to donate money to inaugural committees. There's no sign the Trump Inauguration Committee, though, knew about it. With me now, NBC investigative reporter Ken Dilanian, Evelyn Farkas, who is a former Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary, Kim Wei Lee, who was an Associate Independent Counsel during the Whitewater investigation, and former U.S. Attorney Guy Lewis. Great to have all of you with us on this Friday evening. Ken, let me begin with you. Tell us a little bit more about this guilty plea today and what unfolded.
Eamon, this case appears to have come out of the investigation of Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's former campaign chairman, who was running this massive lobbying operation on behalf of a Russian-backed Ukrainian oligarch. Now, this conduct, Sam Patten comes in after the oligarch, Viktor Yanukovych, had fled in exile to Russia, and Manafort was trying to reconstitute the political party, which was known as the Party of Regions, and he formed something called the Opposition Bloc. And according to these court documents, Sam Patten was lobbying for the Opposition Bloc inside the United States. He was being paid by this foreign political party, and that's illegal because he never registered as a foreign agent with the Justice Department. And in fact, he gave media interviews saying that he was not doing any lobbying in the United States. And as you said, the more interesting part of this plea agreement, he was not charged with this conduct, but he admitted to funneling a straw donation of $50,000 from a foreign source, his Ukrainian client, to the Donald Trump Inauguration Committee. Now, what we don't know, Eamon, is was this just a case of his Ukrainian client wanting to get tickets to the inaugural and attend the parties, or was this a way to potentially curry favor and buy influence with Donald Trump? And who knew about that? Those are the interesting questions raised by that straw donation issue, Eamon.
Ken, do we know really quickly who made the straw payment on behalf of these two men? Because as you were saying, the money was obviously funneled through some straw donor. And do we know whether that donor was a willing accomplice to this or perhaps not?
That person is not named in the court documents, and we haven't confirmed that person's identity. But we do know from other reporting that one of his Ukrainian clients was the chief of staff to Viktor Yanukovych, a Ukrainian politician who is a member of parliament today, Eamon.
Yeah, so very interesting there. We're going to delve into it a little bit more. But, Kim, I want to first get your reaction to today's development. What is your take on what we saw today?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is that we are seeing the Mueller investigation and other parts of the Justice Department moving in on the question of what people refer to as Russian collusion, right? So the Manafort trial is about financial crimes. We hear a lot about obstruction of justice from the White House potentially, but here we have a close associate of Manafort who is essentially secretly lobbying Congress, lobbying the executive branch, as you mentioned, funneling payments to the President's Inaugural Committee on behalf of foreign governments that aren't interested in the well-being of the American voter. And I think a lot of people, this is very complicated, and viewers and Americans want to understand, why should this matter? Why should we care about this? And we should care about this because we want free and fair elections in this country. We want to know who's contributing to political parties. And I think what this tells us is that the Mueller team is on this. And of course, the other question is, how much does this person know that's going to exert additional pressure on Manafort to potentially start cooperating with the Justice Department with the other information that he's aware of?
So let me ask you this, because you brought up the issue of collusion. One, do you think that there is a relationship or correlation between what we saw today with Samuel Patten and the delay of the Paul Manafort trial?
You know, that's a good question. It's really difficult to answer that. I was a young lawyer in the Whitewater investigation. One thing that really struck me was how little the public knows about what's actually happening inside the investigation. We have so much information about what the Russians did at this point. We have multiple indictments from the Mueller team, as well as we know they hacked the election, that the Russians were behind that. It went to WikiLeaks. The information information came out within a half an hour of the Access Hollywood tape. So we'll just have to sit back and see how these pieces are put together. But it's pretty evident that the Justice Department is looking at this as a widespread, almost like a criminal enterprise with lots of players. And we'll just have to see, as I mentioned, how it unfolds publicly.
So, Evelyn, your take on this as well, when you now look at two additional, I don't want to call them Russians, obviously, one Ukrainian, one Russian, but certainly pro-Russian, perhaps in their political outlooks or political interest, once again appearing at the presidential inauguration. What is your take on what we saw today?
Yeah, I mean, Ayman, I think it's really interesting. In addition to what, you know, I forgot her name right now, the journalist just mentioned, or the lawyer just mentioned, you know, I would say is the fact that
Ken or Kim? Ken was the reporter who was telling us. Yeah, okay.
I think about what's important to note about these actors working in Ukraine, and specifically with regard to Konstantin Kilimnik, you know, he's already been fingered by Mueller as basically a Russian operative. And so if this American has been working closely, this Sam Patton fellow, has been working that closely with Kilimnik and Manafort, you know, was Patton aware that Kilimnik had these ties back to the Kremlin? And was Manafort aware? And again, it gets back to the question of Manafort. You know, was he a witting agent of the Russian government or an unwitting agent? I think it does matter. Although, of course, in his actions, maybe it doesn't make a difference in the eye of the law. But I do think that it's important for us to understand eventually. We don't know whether Robert Mueller will tell the American people, but I do think that this points to the question of the Kremlin culpability. And then there's the other piece of it, which Bloomberg mentioned in their article about Cambridge Analytica, that this guy, Sam, was also involved at one point with Cambridge Analytica. So do those relationships actually endure throughout the campaign? Because I think his involvement was earlier.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see all the threads that are kind of overlapping here with all these various aspects. Guy, I wanted to get your reaction. Rudy Giuliani talked about this plea deal today. Take a listen to this.
Nothing to do with the president, nothing to do with collusion, everything to do with a lobbyist who acted improperly, who the president doesn't know. So far, every indictment is unrelated to the president. We went through an entire Manafort trial, and there wasn't a single mention of the president.
Well, this was related directly to the inauguration.
But not to the president.
So Giuliani here is saying this has nothing to do with the president. But when you're listening to the point that Ken made earlier, which is that we don't know why these men paid $50,000 to come attend the inauguration. Were they just come and have a good time and party it up in D.C. with a bunch of politicians? Or were they coming to try to get access to an incoming administration so that they could ultimately shape policy and have some kind of influence? How is it possible that Rudy Giuliani makes that kind of statement when we don't know the answer to why these two men paid $50,000?
Well, I mean, first of all, the mayor's a pretty good lawyer, and he's going to put a spin on it that is completely, totally pro-Trump. And that's what he should be doing, frankly. But what's fascinating about this, and Kim's 100% right, what this tells me is three quick things. One, we are not in the wind-down phase of this investigation.
Yeah.
I mean, they are still indicting people and charging people, and it's going to continue. I mean, bet the house it's going to continue. Number two, follow the money. Follow the money. They didn't pay $50,000 to $100,000 to go rub shoulders with a bunch of politicians. It just is not the way Washington works. You pay the money, you have an expectation of something in return. And three, for people that really want to pound Mueller and say, well, he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, I mean, chalk up another win. Yet another win for Bob Mueller and his team.
Yeah, slow and methodical, but man, he is still moving forward. Ken, one of the interesting themes that we've kind of seen emerge out of all this is that these two, the Russian and the Ukrainian man, they are not the only Russians to have appeared at President Trump's inauguration. What more do we know about Russians at the president's inauguration?
That's right, Eamon. There have been reports of other Russian and Russian Americans who at least attended the inauguration. No other report of an illegal foreign donation, but one of them was billionaire Victor Vekselberg and his cousin Andrew Intrater. And if you remember those names, it may be because you heard reports that these people were paying Michael Cohen some $1 million in a consulting arrangement to help their business. And so, and when these reports emerged at the time, people were trying to figure out, why are these people attending Donald Trump's inauguration? What's the connection here? It raises a number of interesting questions, Damon.
Yeah, to say the least, and none of them, I think, have been answered as of yet. I think that adds more speculation to why these two men were there and paid $50,000 to get access to the inauguration. Kim, let's talk a little bit about the deal itself. How could somebody like Samuel Patten help prosecutors in the broader investigation into collusion, obstruction of justice, or any other wrongdoings?
Well, I think what's interesting is that both Patten and Manafort had worked for the same, did lobbying on behalf of the same Ukrainian political party. So presumably, this person knows some information about Manafort's relationship with the Ukrainians and the Putin support potentially for Ukrainian interests, which also made its way into, at least into the potential, the Republican Party platform during the presidential election. And as I mentioned before, it's like reading, every 40th page of Moby Dick and trying to figure out what the story's about. You have to read every page. And right now, not only Bob Mueller, but also because he's farming out some of these prosecutions to other parts of the Justice Department, other parts of the Justice Department now have pieces of it. So it's a widespread, complicated puzzle. And I understand that, even lawyers, former prosecutors like some of myself and people on the panel and others have a hard time paying attention to it. And it's something that I think is very difficult for the American people to understand. But I think what they need to think about is that, do you want, when you cast your vote, that to matter based on your own political views and who you want to be representing you in your government, and not Vladimir Putin and his cronies? That's the issue right now.
Guys, I want all of you guys to stay with me just for another minute. We have another breaking story that we're following tonight. The author of the Trump-Russia dossier reportedly told a Department of Justice lawyer that Russians had Trump over a barrel. The Associated Press learning today that Bruce Ohr said Christopher Steele told him in July of 2016 that Russian intelligence believed that they had Trump, quote, over a barrel during the 2016 campaign. With me by phone now is the reporter who broke that story, Chad Day of the Associated Press. Chad, great to have you with us this evening. Let's talk a little bit about your reporting. Steele saying that the Russians believed they had Trump over a barrel. What does that suggest? How do you understand that statement to mean?
Right. So we understand that statement to mean that they had compromising information on Donald Trump. And, these comments appear to mirror a lot of the details that were included in, as you mentioned, the Steele dossier. Now, why this is important, though, I think that we should point out is that this is the first time that we're actually hearing these details, Bruce Ohr's own account of his contacts with Steele. So, what we're finding out is that, this was something that Steele was trying to warn people about, and that he went to Bruce Ohr at this point because he was very concerned that Russian intelligence had compromising information at that point on a leading candidate for president.
Why Bruce Ohr? Because Republicans, to some extent, are looking at Bruce Ohr, and the president certainly attacked Bruce Ohr as being part of the deep state, if you want to use that expression, according to them. But why do you think there was that communication between Steele and Bruce Ohr?
Right. So Steele and Ohr had known each other for about 10 years at this point. And it should be noted that, Ohr has deep experience in investigating Russian organized crime. That's something that he did at the Justice Department and as a prosecutor. And, they kind of bonded over this connection where Steele, as an ex-MI6 agent, had deep ties into Russia and was very much interested in tracking Russian organized crime. And he had previously actually provided information to the Justice Department that they had found credible and used in bringing other cases and also passing along to other intelligence agencies.
So at the time that this meeting took place, this meeting between Bruce Ohr and Christopher Steele, where he relayed that information, what was happening with the Russia probe at the time? Do we have a sense of where the general intelligence community's assessment was of Russia's involvement in American elections or trying to shape it?
We do. And, this was right at the beginning of the FBI's Russia, counterintelligence investigation into Russian election interference and any possible ties with the Trump campaign. That investigation, now we know, according to both Republican and democratically authored memos, was actually triggered by information about George Papadopoulos, another Trump campaign foreign policy advisor who had contacts with Russians and in particular, who had talked to him about, saying that the Russian government had dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of emails. So what we know about this point in time is that it's a very early on part of the investigation where they were trying to, there was a lot of anxiety about trying to figure out what are these bits of information that we're collecting about any type of Russian election interference.
Yeah, pretty significant development on that front. Chad Day from the Associated Press. Thank you very much, Chad, for joining us. Back to our panel. Evelyn, let me first get your reaction to this story, this assessment by Christopher Steele, reporting it back to Bruce Ohr. What do you make of the information that the Russians or the Russian intelligence agencies had President Trump, or at the time Trump, over the barrel?
Well, I think, Ivan, based on what we saw on the dossier, the Russians likely did have information relating to Trump and his finances, and possibly this performance, this evening that he spent in the Moscow hotel with prostitutes. We don't know that part, to our knowledge, publicly has not been verified, confirmed by the FBI. But we know many other parts of the dossier have been confirmed publicly through press work, good journalistic work, and also through some of the work that the Justice Department has done. So I would say that I'm not surprised that he came and said that the Russians believe they have Trump over a barrel. The Russians probably believe that anyway, because you just have to listen to Donald Trump speak. But I think that they probably really did have some information, some of which is now public. The other part of this, though, I think that's important to mention is this didn't start with Papadopoulos or the dossier, I believe. I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but don't forget that the FBI is not the only component of our intelligence community. And the component that's looking closely at the Russians the whole time is, of course, the CIA and the other agencies that are focused outwardly. And they must have been already aware. So before this counterintelligence investigation got kicked off in the FBI, I can only imagine that there was something else happening internal to the intelligence community. And this, of course, gets to the whole issue of President Obama and the White House going to the Congress and saying, hey, we're seeing this evidence. We need your help here. The Russians have infiltrated into tried to infiltrate into some of the voting rolls, et cetera, the mechanics of our voting system, in addition to the other things that they did. So I think it's important to bear in mind that the dossier is just one piece of it. But certainly if you're Bruce Ohr and you know this guy's credible, meaning Chris Steele, you're going to be alarmed and you're going to do your job.
And you certainly take that meeting as well. I don't think anyone would necessarily fault Bruce Ohr for taking that meeting.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.